Big story making international headlines is around this crisis between Russia and Ukraine. In the latest developments, the United States and the European Union have announced a set of sanctions against Russia after the Kremlin recognized two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as independent states. That move coming after members of Russia's parliament gave the green light for the deployment of Russia's army abroad. Putin, Vladimir Putin that is, was the Russian president, has since ordered troops into eastern Ukraine, framing the movement as some kind of peacekeeping effort. But the decision comes after Russia massed some 150,000 troops on its border with Ukraine, sparking fears from the West that in fact he intends to invade that country. The question, of course, is this the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and is there any hope for some kind of diplomatic solution? Well, Stephen Gruzd is the head of the African Governance and Diplomacy program at the SA Institute of International Affairs. He joins us now for his thoughts via our video link from Johannesburg. And it's great to see you, Stephen. Thank you so much indeed for making time in these surprising times, for lack of a better term. Of course, the headline story as of this morning is around these sanctions that not only come from the US and the EU, but also Japan and Australia adding to that growing list. But do you think that will work, especially in a context where already there's been comments around Russia not being Afghanistan, not being Iran, not being a country, essentially, that's got a limping economy to begin with?
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I think Vladimir Putin has factored in that he would be facing sanctions into his calculations. I know they've been stockpiling reserves of currency, and it's interesting to see places like Australia, which are very far away from Ukraine and Russia, imposing sanctions. This was to be expected. But, you know, sanctions also have a very limited reach. Russia has been under sanctions since 2014 when it invaded and occupied Crimea and carved it off from Ukraine. There's been a low-level conflict in these very breakaway republics since 2014, and sanctions have been in place. So it might hurt some individuals. That they are what are often called smart sanctions, where they target particular individuals close to the regime and then ban them from travel and so forth and freeze their assets. It may have an effect, but they haven't really worked for the last 8 years. They certainly haven't worked if the object was to deter further expansionism by Russia.
The difficulty with sanctions, of course, is that it reduces the leverage, whatever leverage existed, to have any kind of favorable outcome through diplomatic channels. I mean, as far as you're concerned, is that door still open? Can diplomacy potentially still solve this crisis?
I think the door is always open on diplomacy. Even at the last minute, it's possible for people to talk. If we look back in history at events like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the Russians moved nuclear warheads into Cuba, and that went on for days and days, and they were staring down the barrel of a gun, literally, and that crisis was resolved by diplomacy. I think there always is a window, but it just does seem that window is very narrow at the moment. For example, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was meant to meet the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Thursday. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. The mooted summit between Putin and Biden also may not happen. So it's very, very possible that open hostilities between Russian forces and Ukrainians could go to a hot war very soon. So diplomacy doesn't look very likely now, especially after Putin's speech the other night and his moving in of what he has called peacekeepers. I don't think anybody really believes they're peacekeepers. Diplomacy is looking unlikely, but you never know. And I think everybody will be making whatever efforts they can to get the sides talking rather than shooting.
Absolutely, because we all know that war really benefits no one ultimately. But that aside, you know, it almost feels like Europe has been in this moment of suspended animation, for lack of a better term. We've always been anticipating some kind of movement, and the move that kind of sparked these dramatic series of events was, of course, Putin deciding to recognize those two regions in the eastern parts of Ukraine as some kind of independent states. But what underpins this is Russia not wanting Ukraine to be part of NATO. Why is that important?
Well, because Russia is the inheritor of the former Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, many of the republics that were part of the Soviet Union, the socialist republics, broke away and were independent states. So that includes Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, all the Stans, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and of course Ukraine. So Russia feels that it lost an enormous amount of territory and population in the humiliation that was 1991. Putin has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. And essentially, I think what he wants to do is redraw the map of Europe. Now, what happened was many of those countries, including the Baltic states, have joined NATO in the intervening years. And that, to Putin, means that the front of the West that wants to topple him, that's what he believes, and wants to invade Russia, and it has moved very steadily eastwards. And there was talk of Ukraine joining NATO and also joining the European Union at some point. That hasn't really progressed, but Putin has kind of drawn a red line and said there's no ways that Ukraine is going to be part of NATO. It's essentially part of Russia. Putin goes into a long historical discussion of how they're essentially one people and that there's no legitimate Ukrainian nationalism. And so it's a desire to redraw the borders and to try and win what was lost back in 1991.
Sure. And, of course, that being slammed as undermining Ukraine's sovereignty. Joe Biden, who announced those sanctions, I think it was in a briefing just yesterday, a few hours ago, to be quite frank, also calling on the international community to act, to do something. The silence from Durko here at home is perhaps deafening, right? And I guess that's no surprise when you think about if it were to come to it, which side, so to speak, South Africa would have to take when you think about the BRICS coalition.
Indeed, I think there has been silence from Durko. I checked, and there's no statement. I think it's going to play it very cautiously. Of course, it is. If it had to pick a side, if it was forced to do so, I think it's not a surprise that it would pick Russia. As you said, they are together in the BRICS, and the ties between the two countries have been growing steadily. There's a shared suspicion of Western motives and Western moves. But yeah, South Africa might be in a bit of a pickle because it also defends the territorial integrity and sovereignty of African states when anything like this happens. So one would think to be consistent, it would support Ukraine, but that's not how politics works. And it's very likely that South Africa may, in the end, put out a statement that's very generic and says that we must respect borders and we must respect processes and we must respect dialogue. But yes, people are waiting to see what indeed South Africa says, if indeed South Africa says something.
One has to also consider how big South Africa's voice is on that stage, but perhaps that's a separate discussion altogether. Of course, we'd want to consider what the way forward looks like, despite just how much uncertainty still lingers around this issue. But from your vantage point, what do you reckon are the weight-bearing considerations to be made by either side in trying to solve this crisis?
Well, I think the moving in of the so-called peacekeepers does give Putin a pretext to launch a bigger invasion, a larger invasion, because it might be very easy to manufacture some kind of skirmish and then escalate the process. It's very difficult to say what's going to happen. Putin has surprised people with his moves. I think the sanction moves were predictable and were coming. Russia has amassed massive firepower on the border regions with Ukraine. Some estimates of about 190,000 troops around Ukraine. You know, people are. It's unclear. Is he just going to consolidate where the Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine are? Is he going to take the whole of those provinces? Is he going to push to Kiev and try and get a much more compliant regime in the capital? Nobody really knows at this point, but most are expecting that war is going to be the next outcome.
Sure. Interesting times. It's just one way to put it. Stephen Gruzd, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stephen, of course, is part of the South African Institute of International Affairs. In fact, he is the head of African governance and diplomacy program there. Once again, Stephen, thanks very much indeed.